Hello and welcome to part 4 of my series of ranking my top 50 favorite albums of the 1970s. So number 4 means today we're going to rank number 20 to 11. So I don't really have to say it, I think, but really big masterpieces and albums that are really dear to my heart. The first one today is Superfly, my favorite album by Curtis Mayfield. He had several great albums in the 70s, especially the first half of the 70s. But this is my favorite album. It's really the mood, the vibe, the feel of it. It's a soundtrack to a blaxploitation movie called Superfly. I've never ever watched that movie. Unfortunately, maybe I hope someday I will watch it. Must be really cool, to finally see the visuals to that great music. Yeah, it's a great funky record. It's songs like Little Child Running Wild, it's just the opener, are almost, hinting in a disco direction, but I also think this must have been very influential to hip hop, old school hip hop, the percussions and I think that some of the hook lines, that those are hook lines that often turn up as samples in hip hop songs. I think, and great songs, almost every song of that album. Pusher Man, Freddy's Dead. There's also something like Junkie Chase, which of course is an instrumental. I suppose for someone who's chasing a junkie with a car. That's the cool thing when you haven't watched the movies. You have your own. You have your own images, your own what you think this could be in the movie. But so there are also like songs that aren't really songs, but just for the movie. But even those I think are cool, and the title song is of course great. It's a fantastic album. Number 19, Neil Young, Rust Never Sleeps. This is a kind of a live album, but I don't count live albums in such lists. So it's more of a studio album than a live album. I think there are also lots of overdubs. Plus, it's more live album in the sense like the initially intended Get Back by the Beatles would have been a live album because it's only new material. So it's a brand new album with new songs, and they deleted. They subdued the audience, so you can't really hear any audience in it. So it's like a brand new studio album, but played live in one take, so to speak. And some of Neil Young's best songs are among those 9 songs. The first half is acoustic, him and acoustic guitar and harmonica, and more and more the band comes in, and side 2 is then it's really the hard rocking, the grungy, the godfather of grunge side of Neil Young with Crazy Horse and feedback driven songs. And the best songs, the best song to me would be probably my favorite, or one of my 2 or 3 favorite Neil Young songs ever, Powderfinger, which is the first song on the second side of the vinyl. But also the acoustic songs like Thrasher, Pocahontas, Sail Away, and of course the iconic My Hey Hey, which is also Hey Hey My. There's the acoustic version, the electric version. Fantastic album. Number 18 is something that I've got hanging on that wall, so I have to look there. It's Histoire de Melody Nelson by Serge Gainsbourg. Here you can see it. Some of my favorite albums I've got hanging on my wall, and this is one of those albums. It's a perfect late 60s album in the style of someone like what Scott Walker would do. Also at that time, very symphonic, folky music, but also those great psychedelic arrangements and very McCartney-esque, cool bass lines, but symphonic, lots of strings, and it's I don't really speak French. I understand some bits of that language, but I'm not fluent in French. But it's a kind of not just a kind, it's a concept album about a girl called Melody Nelson, which is kind of, played by or sung by Jane Birkin, which at that time was Serge Gainsbourg's girlfriend. So some parts he's singing and some parts she is singing, and it's very fantastic, very autumn. In autumn this is a great album. One could say erotic folk pop symphony concept kind of album. Great. There's only this album that sounds like that. It's kind of a unique album. Although I think many artists after that tried to some parts of that sound. Some artists tried to make their own version of it. For example, the French duo Air in the 90s, but also Beck on his album Sea Change. There's lots of, I think they took a lot of inspiration from the sound aesthetic, this very unique sound aesthetic of that album. It's one of those albums you have to listen to from song 1 to the last song in sequence. It doesn't really make much sense to pick out single songs of that album. Next one is my favorite Led Zeppelin album? I think so. Physical Graffiti, the double album, the only studio double album the band made, and so the strengths of that band I think are best portrayed in this album, because the strength of this band was that it wasn't just a hard rock band, as it was often classified, but a band that really experimented with lots of different styles, so that there are so many songs on there helps with, showing that colorfulness, that eclecticism of the band. There's even one song that's going into an Indian direction, into the light, which I always love, those kind of Indian leaning songs in pop music with sitars and stuff. But there's also classic Led Zeppelin, hard rock, there's folk stuff. One of the best songs, maybe also the most well-known song from that album, Kashmir, is, this, like with Serge Gainsbourg, with that album, Kashmir is a song, only this song sounds like this song, there's only Kashmir, that's its own style in one song, and also great Eastern kind of sounding, but rocking. Great song, great album, Physical Graffiti. Next one is, again, I think I have to do this several times in this video, but maybe that's kind of nice for you to make a walk through my wall of fame. Leonard Cohen's Songs of Love and Hate. Very moody album, very typical melancholy by Leonard Cohen. You shouldn't be depressed when you listen to that album. It's a very wintry album. Especially the first song, Avalanche. That's again, like with Serge Gainsbourg, erotic folk in a way, but much more, but darker than the Serge Gainsbourg album. It's really a very special mood, this album, and again an album that's often with 70s albums, but especially with those favorite albums of mine. It's not really an album where I could or should pick out single songs. You really should take your time to let the whole album unfold. Next album is number 15. Maybe that's one of the exceptions. This is an album which also has very great single songs. This is an album where you could pick out 4 or 5, really 10 out of 10 single tracks, but still also as an album, as a piece of art. It's also a great album masterpiece, of course, but this is an album with hits. Tapestry by Carole King, her best album, in my opinion. So many great songs. I Feel the Earth Moves So Far Away. It's Too Late, it's the first 3 songs. I can just read the whole album to you. But let's go a bit further. Side 2 opens with You've Got a Friend. It was a big hit for James Taylor, but of course Carole King, one of the best songwriters of all time, wrote that song. I think also about James Taylor, and he covered it. I think it was about his heroin addiction. Where You Lead, which was later used as the title song for Gilmore Girls, and Carole King even had a reoccurring guest starring role in Gilmore Girls, which is I'm a kind of a big Carole King fan, especially of that album, and I also have to admit I liked Gilmore Girls, so that was cool. She played a grumpy record shop or music instrument shop owner, which was really funny in itself, and also great song. And Will You Love Me Tomorrow? That's one of her old songs, a song from the early '60s, from the Goffin King days. Even the Beatles covered on the first album a Goffin King song. So when she was very young, when she was still a teenager in the early '60s, with Goffin, she had a songwriting partnership, and even the Beatles covered the song Chains on the Please Please Me album. And Will You Love Me Tomorrow is one of those very early songs. I think the Shirelles were the artists who had the original version, but she made her own early '70s cool singer-songwriter, pianist version, and it's also a great cover. I like cats, so this is a cover for me. But also, she's relaxed on there. It's this casual photo, and one of the best singer-songwriter albums of all time, in my opinion. The next one is again from The Wall, but now the way is a bit shorter than the last two. It's Marquee Moon by Television, also one of the best debut albums of all time. Must have been 75 or 76. The CBGB New York punk days, the early punk, very influential album, of course. And I think The Strokes, there would be no The Strokes without that album, especially how the two guitars interact with each other. And, what can I say, one of the best debut albums of all time. And very atypical punk album. That was punk before it was even called punk, or before there was a formula for punk, because usually punk is like 3-minute songs, but on this album, I think most of the songs are more than 6 minutes, so it's like prog punk, almost artsy prog punk in a way. And a very romantic album also. It was called Rimbaud Punk, so it's very poetic, romantic music lyrically as well. Great album. And the next is maybe the most controversial today, because I think most of the albums I've talked about today, at least in music nerd circles, are considered really big masterpieces and mostly like the best albums of these artists. The next one, I think, isn't considered the best album by this artist, and isn't even considered the best 1970s album by this artist. I love all albums that this artist has made from like 1969, when Astral Weeks, so now you know who I'm talking about, came out, until the late 80s. So like 20 years in a row he didn't make bad albums, in my opinion. But my favorite album is like in the middle between 1969 and 1989, because it's 1979, I think, that this album came out, and it's not talked about much, even by fans of Van Morrison. We're talking about Van Morrison. But my favorite Van Morrison album, next to Astral Weeks, which didn't qualify because it's from the 60s, but my second favorite Van Morrison album is Into the Music from 1979. Very underrated. In my series of underrated albums, I haven't done it yet, but it's surely a contender for that. The side A is a very good side, but side B, that's one of the albums, often side A is the better side on albums, but this is one of the albums with one of my favorites, side Bs. And my favorite, I think my all-time favorite Van Morrison song is also on here, and The Healing Has Begun, also on side 2. But this is a great storming Celtic soul album. This must have been very, very influential to Dexy Midnight Runners, especially their Toorai album, the album of Common Eileen. Some of the songs on this album are like blueprints to Common Eileen and those Dexys Midnight Runners songs. Great. Number 11 isn't very surprising for subscribers to my channel. It's my favorite Paul McCartney solo album, and next to All Things Must Pass, my favorite Beatles solo album. It's Ram from 1971. I've talked so often about this album, so I make it very, very, very quick. Just watch videos like my ranking of the Paul McCartney albums or my ranking of my favorite Beatles solo albums. This is Paul McCartney's big masterpiece, misunderstood at the time when it came out, but each and every song is a pop masterpiece, and it's probably the only album where Paul McCartney is really angry. You know, it's shortly after the split of the Beatles, and they were still fighting, especially him and John Lennon. So this is, for once, you get an angry, emotional Paul McCartney, and you know, he should have been angry more often in his career. You know, personally, for his private life, it's probably cool that he's so Chef Hamza loved and always cheerful and happy. But you know, once he was in a bad mood, and then he made this masterpiece, which is still a very upbeat album. You know, don't get me wrong, it's not like a Kurt Cobain Nirvana album or Leonard Cohen or what have you. This is still a very positive sounding album, but you know, for Paul McCartney, it's a kind of, in the lyrics, some negativity. And number 11 is one of my favorite Bob Dylan albums. You know, my all-time favorite Bob Dylan album is Highway 61, and that's from the 60s. And the same thing that we had with Van Morrison, that the favorite album isn't from the 70s. But my favorite 70s Bob Dylan album is not Blood on the Tracks. You know, I even ranked Slow Train Coming better than Blood on the Tracks. Most people would say Blood on the Tracks. To me, it's Desire, and this is the real breakup album. You know, I said it when I reviewed in this series Blood on the Tracks, that I don't really get why people always call it the divorce album. You know, Blood on the Tracks was when the seeds of the divorce were planted, but this is the divorce album. I think this is when they really finally got divorced. And the song Sarah, that's one of the most heartbreaking songs I've ever heard, and it's also the sequel to my all-time favorite Bob Dylan song, Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands from 1966's Blonde on Blonde. That's a song about him falling in love and adoring Sarah. And in the song Sarah, which closes this album, he's even talking about how he wrote Sad-Eyed Lady of the Lowlands for her. And that's, you know, as I said, it's my favorite Bob Dylan song. So and Sarah is also one of my favorite Bob Dylan songs. So this two-part tragedy about his relationship with Sarah, that's one of the coolest, you know, saddest but also coolest things in pop history. And the whole album has this very sad mood. You know, the first song, Hurricane, isn't about, of course, about the separation from Sarah. But it's also a sad song because it's about that boxer that was jailed, but didn't. You know, Hurricane was a boxer who got in jail for a murder he didn't commit, and this is a great. You know, this is back to his protest song roots. This song, but after that, as I said, very emotional, personal songs about his failed relationship, and you know, one of my favorite albums about a failed relationship in that sense, Desire by Bob Dylan. That was the 4th installment of this series, and the 5th will be the last. This will be the top 10 favorite albums of the 70s, plus some honorable mentions, or many honorable mentions probably. Thank you very much for watching. Till next time, goodbye.